Your thoughts do not keep going because something is wrong. They keep going because your brain is still trying to finish something, even when the environment is quiet, even when the day is over, even when there is no immediate problem. The mind remains active, reviewing, reorganizing, anticipating, checking, and that can be exhausting. But there is one detail that completely changes the way we understand this experience. The brain does not stop thinking when there are no problems. It stops thinking when it realizes that everything is safe enough. There is an important difference between silence and safety. Silence is the absence of stimulation. Safety is the absence of threat. And the brain was designed to monitor threat, not silence. That is why thoughts can continue even in a peaceful environment. You may be lying down, lights off, phone away, house quiet, and still the mind keeps working, replaying conversations, reviewing decisions, imagining possibilities, preparing responses. This experience does not mean that you have lost control. It means that the system is still vigilant. And vigilance is one of the most important functions of the human brain. There is a concept in neuroscience called the predictive brain. The predictive brain does not wait for something to happen in order to react. It tries to anticipate. It calculates possibilities. It evaluates risks. It prepares before events occur. This mechanism is extremely useful. It prevents mistakes, it improves decisions, it increases safety. But when this system remains active for long periods of time, it creates a continuous stream of thoughts, not because there is danger, but because the brain is still checking, still evaluating, still trying to conclude. Imagine a night security guard walking through a building. The doors are locked, the lights are off, everything looks normal. Even so, the guard keeps walking, observing, listening, checking, not because there is danger, but because safety needs confirmation. Your mind works in a very similar way. It performs mental rounds, reviews information, tests possibilities, looks for signals, and sometimes those rounds continue longer than necessary. That is when thoughts begin to feel endless. There is another concept that helps explain this pattern. It is called cognitive looping. Cognitive looping happens when the brain repeats the same thought in an attempt to reach a conclusion. Conclusion means closure, resolution, certainty. When that closure does not happen, the brain keeps working. It returns to the same subject, the same memory, the same concern, again and again. Not because it wants to bother you, but because it wants to finish the process. Consider a simple situation. You send an important message. Time passes, and there is no response. The mind begins to imagine, did they see it? Did I say something wrong? Should I send another message? Nothing dangerous is happening, but uncertainty remains, and uncertainty keeps the brain active. This mechanism is related to a phenomenon known as the unfinished task effect. When something remains incomplete, the brain keeps that information active, like a file left open in the background, consuming energy, using attention, even while you are doing other things. This background activity is one of the main reasons thoughts continue, especially at night, especially in moments of silence, because silence creates space, and when space appears, the brain fills it with what has not yet been resolved. There is also a specific network in the brain responsible for this type of internal activity. It is called the default mode network. This network becomes active when you are not focused on external tasks, when you are resting, waiting, taking a shower, driving, or trying to fall asleep. This network helps you reflect, plan, remember, imagine. But when it remains active for too long, it produces a continuous chain of thoughts. One thought leads to another. One memory leads to a concern. One concern leads to a prediction. And the cycle continues. That cycle may seem disorganized, but it follows logic. It follows patterns. Patterns shaped by experience, responsibility, expectations, and perceptions of risk. Perception of risk does not have to be dramatic. It can be subtle. A conversation that felt ambiguous, a decision that did not feel complete, a responsibility that has not yet been finished. The brain registers those signals and keeps working, trying to resolve them. There is another detail that very few people notice. The brain prefers certainty, not comfort. Certainty reduces effort. Certainty reduces vigilance. Certainty allows rest. Uncertainty does the opposite. It increases monitoring, it increases preparation, it increases mental activity, even when the situation is safe. That is why many people notice their thoughts becoming louder at night. Not because the night is dangerous, but because the night removes distractions. During the day, attention is occupied. Tasks require responses. Conversations demand presence. Movement consumes energy. When the day slows down, the brain finally finds time to process what was postponed. Pending thoughts return. Unanswered questions reappear. Unresolved situations come back into awareness, and mental activity continues. This process is known as neural rehearsal. Neural rehearsal is the way the brain prepares. It reviews conversations, simulates scenarios, tests responses, evaluates possible outcomes. This rehearsal improves performance. But when it becomes excessive, it creates mental fatigue. There is also a state called anticipatory vigilance. Anticipatory vigilance means staying alert to what might happen, not to what is happening, to what could happen. This state keeps the system prepared, ready, responsive. But preparation consumes energy, and energy consumption produces fatigue. Another important concept is thought inertia. Thought inertia explains why one idea leads to another, and another, and another. Like an automatic sequence, one memory creates a concern. The concern creates a prediction. The prediction creates a plan, and before you realize it, the mind is moving quickly, even without an immediate reason. This sequence does not indicate loss of control. It indicates continuity of processing. The brain is still working, still organizing, still trying to finish. And the greater a person's responsibilities, the greater the volume of information the brain needs to manage. Responsibilities create mental load. Mental load requires processing. Continuous processing generates persistent thoughts. That is why responsible people, committed people, careful people, often have more active minds. Their systems were trained to observe, to anticipate, to prepare. This ability is valuable, but it can also be exhausting, especially when the body attempts to rest, because rest reduces external stimulation and makes internal processing more visible. That visibility can feel uncomfortable, but it is not a sign of a problem. It is a sign of activity, mental activity, protective activity, adaptive activity. Your thoughts are not working against you, they are working for you, but sometimes they have not yet realized that they can stop. Now consider another important mechanism. There is an internal system that very few people know about, yet it directly influences the way thoughts behave. This mechanism is called cognitive error monitoring. The brain has specialized systems designed to detect possible mistakes. It observes inconsistencies, detects ambiguity, searches for signals that something might go wrong. This process happens automatically, without conscious effort, without voluntary decision. It is a protective function. When the system detects something incomplete, it keeps the issue active. It keeps attention focused on that point. It keeps the mind working. This mechanism explains why certain thoughts insist on returning, not because they are important, but because they feel unfinished. Now think about a simple situation. You are talking to someone. The conversation ends abruptly. There was no conflict, but there was also no clarity. Something remained open. Hours later, the mind returns to that conversation. It reviews the words, reanalyzes the tone, reinterprets expressions. This happens because the brain seeks coherence. It tries to organize the experience. It tries to close the loop. When closure is not found, the thought remains. This pattern is related to a phenomenon called the need for psychological closure. Human beings have a natural tendency to seek conclusions. Conclusions reduce uncertainty. Conclusions reduce mental effort. Conclusions allow rest. Without conclusion, the system remains active. There is another factor worth noticing: what is known as the emotional tolerance window. This window represents the range in which the nervous system can process experiences with balance. Within this range, the mind functions clearly. The body remains stable. Emotions remain manageable. But when demands exceed this capacity, the system enters a state of alert, not necessarily fear, but vigilance. This state increases mental activity, increases sensitivity, increases the number of thoughts, not because the person lost control, but because the system is trying to reorganize. Notice how this often happens after intense days. Important meetings, difficult decisions, sensitive conversations, accumulated responsibilities. Even after everything ends, the brain continues processing. This phenomenon can be described as pending processing. Pending processing means that the experience ended externally, but it has not yet been integrated internally. The body left the situation, but the mind is still working. This detail helps explain why thoughts appear precisely when you try to rest. When external activity decreases, internal processing becomes more noticeable. Another interesting aspect emerges when we observe the role of predictability. The brain likes to predict. Prediction reduces uncertainty. Prediction increases the sense of control. But when there are too many unpredictable situations, the system adapts. It increases vigilance. It increases monitoring. It increases preparation. This state can be described as predictability overload. It does not mean that something bad is happening. It means that the brain is trying to keep up with constant change. Now think about a typical day. Multiple tasks, messages arriving, quick decisions, changes of plans, frequent interruptions. Each one of these situations requires choice, and every choice consumes energy. This wear and tear is known as decision fatigue. Decision fatigue does not mean incapacity. It means an excess of decisions. The greater the number of decisions, the greater the mental effort, and the greater the mental effort, the more time the brain needs to reorganize. That extra time appears as persistent thought. There is also another element called residual cognitive noise. This term describes the mental activity that remains after a task ends. It is similar to the sound that continues echoing after music stops. The stimulus ended, but the effect remains. This noise can appear after an intense day, an emotional conversation, an important responsibility, a prolonged concern. Even when everything has finished, the mind continues reverberating. Another point worth noticing involves the state of cognitive readiness. This state happens when the brain remains prepared to respond quickly. It is common in people who must make frequent decisions. Responsible professionals, parents, managers, caregivers, people who deal with uncertainty. This constant readiness creates efficiency, but it also keeps the system active. And continuous activity requires recovery. When recovery does not happen, thoughts persist. Notice how this completely changes the way we interpret a restless mind. This is not about losing control. This is not about weakness. This is not about anxiety without reason. It is about a system that is functioning, a system trying to protect, a system trying to organize, a system trying to conclude. Now observe another important detail. The brain does not measure only the present. It measures future possibilities. It calculates scenarios. It evaluates consequences. It simulates outcomes. This process is called prospective simulation. Prospective simulation allows preparation, allows planning, allows anticipation. But when it occurs excessively, it produces worry, it produces repetition, it produces persistent thoughts. This pattern is particularly common in responsible people, committed people, careful people, because they think before acting, they plan before deciding, they evaluate before responding. This ability is valuable, but it requires energy. and energy must be restored. There is another detail that completely transforms this understanding. The mind does not seek silence, it seeks safety. When safety is perceived, thoughts decrease. When safety is uncertain, thoughts increase. This principle explains why the mind can remain active even in calm environments. The environment may be quiet, but the system is still checking, still evaluating, still trying to ensure stability, and while that process is not finished, thoughts continue, not as enemies, but as messengers. Messengers that something is still being processed, messengers that the system is still working, messengers that the brain is still trying to finish. Notice that the mind does not operate only through thoughts. It operates through signals, internal signals, external signals, physical signals. When those signals indicate stability, the system slows down. When they indicate uncertainty, the system speeds up. This response is automatic. It does not depend on decision. It does not depend on willpower. It depends on perception. And often, perception is not related to what is happening in the present. It is related to history, to memory, to accumulated experience. Now consider an important detail. The brain does not react only to what happened. It reacts to what could happen. This behavior is known as the anticipation loop. The anticipation loop keeps the system alert. It reviews scenarios. It calculates possibilities. It prepares responses. This process is useful. It prevents mistakes. It increases safety. It improves performance. But when it remains active for too long, it generates continuous mental activity that may seem excessive, but that is actually an attempt at prevention. Another point worth observing involves tolerance for uncertainty. Each person has a different level of tolerance. Some people handle undefined situations with ease. Others feel the need for quick answers, for clarity, for predictability. When tolerance for uncertainty is lower, the mind works harder. It searches for answers. It looks for explanations. It tries to reduce doubt. This additional effort generates persistent thoughts, not because the person is fragile, but because the system is trying to stabilize. There is a quiet phenomenon that deeply influences this entire process. What is known as baseline vigilance. Baseline vigilance is the minimum level of alertness that the system maintains even at rest, even when nothing is happening, even when the environment is calm. This state is natural. It allows quick reaction. It ensures protection. But when it remains elevated for long periods of time, it consumes energy, and energy consumption keeps the mind active. This detail helps explain why some people struggle to relax, not because they do not want to, but because the system is still prepared. Another relevant aspect involves cognitive efficiency. The brain is efficient. It tries to conserve resources. It simplifies processes. It automates responses. But when there is an excess of information or an excess of responsibility, the system needs to work harder. This increase in effort reduces efficiency. And when efficiency decreases, the mind compensates. That compensation appears as repetitive thinking. Another important element emerges when we observe the concept of physiological closure. Physiological closure is the moment when the body recognizes that an experience has ended, that a task has been completed, that an effort is finished. Without that recognition, the system remains active, as if something were still pending. This mechanism is very common after intense days. The work ended, the meeting finished, the conversation was closed, but the body is still in a state of preparation. That state prolongs mental activity. Another detail worth noticing involves delayed emotional processing. Not all emotions are processed immediately. Some are postponed, deferred, stored. During the day, attention is occupied. Tasks demand focus. Responsibilities demand presence. Emotions remain in the background. When the environment finally slows down, those emotions return, not as problems, but as content waiting to be integrated. That return may appear as thought, as memory, as sensation, as restlessness. Now consider a simple example. You spend the day solving tasks, answering messages, meeting deadlines, talking to people, making decisions. Everything seems under control. But when night arrives, The mind begins to review the day. It remembers conversations, reanalyzes decisions, reinterprets situations. This behavior is not anxiety, it is integration. The brain is organizing information, consolidating experiences, trying to close cycles. Another concept that helps explain this phenomenon is accumulated mental load. Accumulated mental load represents the volume of information the brain needs to manage. The greater that volume, the greater the effort required to reorganize. And the greater the effort, the greater the mental activity. This relationship is direct. Responsibility creates load. Load creates processing. Processing creates thought. Now consider something many people have never realized. Thinking is not the problem. Thinking a lot is not necessarily the problem. The problem is not being able to finish. To finish means to complete, to conclude, to integrate. When closure does not happen, the system remains open, like an application running in the background, consuming energy, using memory, maintaining activity. This functioning is natural, but it can become exhausting, especially when it lasts too long. There is another factor that directly influences the persistence of thoughts: the absence of internal safety signals. The brain needs signals indicating that everything is okay, signals of stability, signals of predictability, signals of completion. Without those signals, it continues monitoring, continues evaluating, continues checking. This behavior does not indicate loss of control. It indicates protection, biological protection, adaptive protection, preventive protection. Another important point appears when we observe the relationship between responsibility and mental activity. Responsible people tend to think more, not because they are anxious, but because they anticipate, plan, organize, forecast. This ability increases efficiency, but it also increases processing, and processing requires energy. When energy decreases, the mind continues trying to finish, trying to resolve, trying to guarantee stability. This prolonged effort creates the sensation of a restless mind, a mind that does not stop, a mind that continues, even when everything seems calm. Now notice an important shift in perspective. The mind is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to protect you. It is not creating problems. It is trying to solve them. It is not failing. It is functioning. Functioning exactly as it was designed, but sometimes functioning for too long. There is another detail that often goes unnoticed. The mind does not remain active because it wants to. It remains active because it has not yet received a clear signal of completion. That signal is known as an internal closure signal. The brain needs to recognize that something has ended, that the task was completed, that the effort is finished, that the environment is safe. Without that recognition, the system remains on, remains alert, remains monitoring. This process is related to a mechanism called the safety verification circuit. This circuit acts like radar. It searches for signals, checks information, reviews data, not to create problems, but to ensure stability. Now imagine a door that has been closed. You know you closed it, but before leaving, you check it again. Not because you doubt yourself, but because you want certainty. This behavior is natural. The brain does something very similar. It checks, reconfirms, reevaluates, and when it does not find a clear signal of closure, it keeps checking. That process can become a cycle, a quiet cycle, an automatic cycle, a cycle that keeps the mind active. Another relevant aspect appears when we observe the phenomenon of neural habituation. Neural habituation is the process through which the brain learns patterns of functioning. If the system spends long periods in a state of vigilance, it adapts. It begins to consider that state normal, a standard, a reference. This means that even when the environment is calm, the system remains prepared, remains attentive, remains monitoring. This pattern can be described as continuous protection. It is not a failure. It is learning. Learning based on experience. That learning explains why some people feel that their mind never turns off. not because something is wrong, but because the system learned to stay alert. Notice how this often happens in people who carry many responsibilities, people who care for others, people who make important decisions, people who must anticipate problems before they occur. Over time, the brain adapts. It keeps the radar on, even when there is no threat. This behavior consumes energy, and energy consumption produces fatigue. This type of fatigue can be described as monitoring fatigue. It is not physical tiredness, it is not sleepiness, it is mental exhaustion, exhaustion created by constant vigilance. Now observe a detail that completely changes the interpretation of a restless mind. Persistent thoughts do not mean loss of control. They indicate continuity of processing. They indicate an attempt to conclude. They indicate a search for stability. This understanding creates an important shift. The mind is not the enemy. It is a protection system, an organization system, a preparation system. Another phenomenon worth noticing involves automatic thought chaining. This chaining happens when one idea leads to another without conscious effort. A memory activates a concern. The concern activates a prediction. The prediction activates a plan. This process is fast, quiet, automatic, and often happens without awareness. This chaining can create the sensation that the mind is out of control, but in reality, it is following a flow based on past experiences, a flow based on learning, a flow based on protection. Now consider a common situation. You lie down to sleep. The body is tired. The environment is quiet, but the mind begins to revisit the day. It recalls a conversation, remembers a task, thinks about something that needs to be done tomorrow. Nothing urgent is happening. Even so, thoughts continue. This behavior is not random, it is predictable. It follows a pattern known as residual mental noise. Residual mental noise is the activity that remains after the stimulus ends. It is like heat that lingers after the fire is gone, or like an echo that remains after the sound fades. The event ended, but the effect continues. That effect decreases over time, especially when the system perceives safety. Now notice a fundamental point. The brain does not seek absolute silence. It seeks predictability. It seeks stability. It seeks coherence. When those elements are present, the mind slows down. When they are absent, the mind remains active. This principle explains why some people think more during moments of rest, not because rest is problematic, but because rest reveals what has not yet been processed. Another important detail appears when we observe the relationship between thought and energy. Thinking requires energy. Repeating thoughts requires even more energy. Monitoring thoughts requires constant energy. When that energy begins to decrease, the system tries to conserve, but at the same time, it tries to finish. This combination creates a curious sensation: mental fatigue combined with mental activity. The person feels tired, but cannot stop thinking. This state is not contradictory. It is adaptive. The brain is trying to finish before shutting down. Now notice something that can completely change the way you see your own mind. An active mind is not a defect. An active mind is a system functioning to protect, functioning to organize, functioning to prepare. But that system needs to learn how to close. To close means to recognize that something ended, to recognize that it is safe, to recognize that it can rest. Without that recognition, the cycle continues. Thoughts continue. Monitoring continues. Preparation continues. There is one more detail that very few people realize. The mind does not need silence in order to rest. It needs completion. Completion reduces vigilance. Completion reduces effort. Completion allows recovery. When completion happens, the mind slows down naturally, without force, without struggle, without control. Now consider the key insights that may have emerged throughout this video. You may have realized that persistent thoughts are not a problem, that the mind remains active because it is still trying to finish, that uncertainty keeps the brain working, that vigilance consumes energy, that processing can continue after the event ends. that the mind seeks safety, not silence, that the brain needs to recognize closure, that thinking is a protection mechanism, that mental activity can be a sign of responsibility, and that an active mind can be the result of adaptation. If at any point in this video an idea made sense to you, if a concept helped explain an experience that once felt confusing, or if an explanation brought clarity about how your own mind works, it may be helpful to register that realization. It could be a sentence, an understanding, a discovery, or that moment when something finally clicked. Sharing that perception is not just commenting, it is consolidating learning. It is transforming knowledge into awareness. And often, when one person describes what they understood, another person recognizes their own experience. Now, a natural question emerges. What happens when these thoughts do not just continue, but begin to repeat? When the same idea returns? When the same scenario reappears? When the same thought insists? That is the next step in this understanding. Because in many cases, the mind does not only continue thinking, it enters a cycle that repeats, a cycle that seems to have no end. And that is exactly what we are going to explore in the next video: why the brain keeps replaying the same thoughts, even when you try to move forward.